Hello again, good afternoon. So our next session is titled Regulating AI Medical Devices. I'm very delighted to have this session as part of the program and as part of our project funded by the Alex Trebek Forum for a Dialogue. And as the chef d'orchestre behind this session and the lead of our conversation is the amazing Colleen Flood, my former colleague. We still love her, but we're very sad that she left a few months ago the University of Ottawa to become the new Dean of Law and a full professor at Queen's University. She still stays as an associate member of CLTS, and she leads the AI and Health stream of the AI and Society initiative. And so until a very recent appointment, she was the University Research Chair in Health and Law Policy at Ottawa, and we collaborated on many events and research projects on AI and Health. So I'm delighted to have you back at home. Thank you, Colleen. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so wonderful to be back here. I was, really warmed and almost overwhelmed with last night's events. They were beautiful, and I really felt that Ian was kind of here. So it was a wonderful event, and I want to thank Florian and everyone at the Center for Law, Technology and Society and the AI Plus initiative for their wonderful work, I think, on behalf of us all in putting together such a great set of days, a great set of speakers. So thank you very much, Florian, and everybody that has contributed to making this such a fantastic event. We wanted to kind of, I don't know, like I do health law. It's like people tell me it's the law of the horse. I say, what's wrong with horses? So kind of the application of law and technology into a specific area. And as a group, we have more or less been involved in a project that Catherine and I lead called Machine MD that focuses on the legal governance of health AI. And we have been working with some wonderful collaborators, patients, innovators, clinicians, to sort of get to grips with the question of whether our existing laws are really up to scratch for governing health AI. So I'll just cut to the punch line. No, they're not. So that caused us to really think and starting to think a lot more deeply about using regulation of medical devices to regulate health AI in Canada. And one of the reasons that we're particularly interested in that is because, as most of you know who are Canadian, healthcare is generally a matter of provincial jurisdiction. But when it comes to the regulation of medical devices, the federal government has established jurisdiction over the safety of medical devices, and that has been expanded to include software. So not just a hard medical device, but an algorithm can be regulated by Health Canada. And so one can see, an enormous upside for innovators if they only have one place to go to be licensed for all of Canada, but also potentially for patients if the federal government, can quote unquote get it right. So that's why we've become very interested in this area of medical devices. And of course, for most of us, health and healthcare is probably one of the most important things that we think about in our lives. And it's not going so well here in Canada. It's not going so well in many jurisdictions right now. So it's really, there's a lot riding on some of these discussions about if AI can help solve some of our problems of access and quality and safety, and then how to innovate in regulation to really respond to the risks that we know that are there. So this is a fabulous panel. We all know each other pretty well, although some folks turning up, I've only ever met them on Zoom, I think, Jake, so it's like, man, he's tall. So I don't know if you've had that happen. It's like you just kind of imagine people are a certain height and then you find them in real life. So I want to just briefly introduce everybody. First, Devin, to my left here, is a wonderful ER doctor at Sick Kids. And, you know, because he's a bit of an overachiever, he's also a computer scientist. I don't know how you do all that, really. He's always perky despite that, and always invested in the work that we're doing. So we have worked closely with Devin to understand the different innovations that he's working on and their application in clinical care. So invaluable insights for him. He's also the CEO and founder of a company called Hero AI. So it's great to have you here, Devin, and it's always great to work with you. Catherine Regis, I've worked with for a long time. She's a Canada Research Chair in Health Law because she likes chairs. She's also a CIFA AI Chair, and she's also the co-founder with a wonderful guy called Jean-Louis Denis of the Health Hub Policy Organization and Law. So it's sort of like a hub of health law and policy discussions in Quebec. Just a fabulous scholar and thinker, and so great that you're here, Catherine. Jake Edua is a newly minted professor in the Lincoln Alexander School of Law, and we've been following his career. We're really, really jealous of the Jason Alexander School of Law for snaffling you, and I'm bummed, really. But anyway, hope springs eternal. I'm just putting that there. And he served as a chief counsel of the African Canadian AI and Data Innovation Consortium, amongst many other roles. So it's so great to work with you, Jake, and so happy to have you here. And last but no means least, we're so happy that Kelvin Ho has come to be with us all the way from Hong Kong. Kelvin is a professor in the Department of Law in Hong Kong and co-director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law. And he provides expert leadership on many topics in bioethics and health law for the World Health Organization as well, and plays a very significant global leadership role on many of these things. So we have a great panel. We have a few questions. I know you're kind of tired. We'll try to make it punchy. So we want to know, I guess we're going to start with you, Jake. We thought we would ask the question is, why is the regulation of health AI or medical AI, if you like, why is this an issue of global concern?
I could just start by saying thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel with each and every one of you whom I consider mentors, and thanks Professor Florian for this really outstanding conference. Why is machine learning based medical device an issue of global concern? I would say three things. One, I think it's an international public health issue. The reason is because the use of machine learning in the health field, I don't think there's any major AI company that has developed, iterated, and deployed their AI system in a way that is only using resources within a domestic jurisdiction. We find that machine learning systems are deterritorial, so they cut across, they kind of like dilute domestic regulatory frameworks. And so therefore, we need to think about this from a very harmonization perspective, which is why I think of it in terms of international public health. But the second thing is about the global market analysis when it comes to medical device AI. Manufacturers want to be sure that they don't have to deal with disparate regulatory protocols across jurisdictions. So this is also very good from an innovative perspective. But from an African perspective, I think the most critical thing here is about the equity issue, right? When we talk about medical device equity, if we're critical about affordability, if we don't want African states to not benefit from medical devices that use AI and the benefits from that, we need to think about access and affordability for low and middle income countries. So I think when we think about this, it's not just jurisdictional from a domestic perspective. We have to think about it from a more global perspective to be able to appreciate the technology well.
Catherine, would you like to weigh in on this one too?
So, hi everybody. Perhaps I can just add on what Jake just mentioned. So first, I see 3 points as well, and you mentioned the case of interoperability. So that's an issue for sure. And it was mentioned as a key consideration for, from a recent survey from OECD, where they consulted with the G7 countries, and at the top of their list of things they worry about that they really want to work on is interoperability in the case of AI for rules and norms. So it's just something that makes a lot of sense for many reasons. As Jake mentioned, there's a business side as well. So we want to make sure that good innovation is possible. So if you have this patchy the framework of regulation across the planet, it's very difficult for good innovation to travel and really be embedded in a different healthcare system. So make it easy for good innovation. I think it's a valuable point. Also, the fact that if it's too complicated for small businesses, it's going to be a problem. Sometimes compliance is easier for big businesses. They have a lot of people to work on this. So if it's not the case and you have a small business, so it's just important to make sure that they don't have to have this hassle factor everywhere they go. So that's another reason. The other one mentioned again is harmonization. So you also want to avoid that there's a forum shopping where we race to the bottom. We really want to discuss and negotiate these standards to make sure that we have a sufficient level among the different countries. And it's important because we have a lot of bilateral agreements. So if we recognize that if one country accepts a medical device using AI, and that we say, well, okay, we're going to recognize this, we want to make sure that we have certain levels that are compatible, and we really have that high-level standard. So that's another one. And the third point I would say, just, we're not the only one working on this. It's an issue that Japan is working on, the US, so let's share good practices and make sure that we build on the expertise of each other. So for instance, the US has tried what I would call the reputational strategy. So if you're a good business, we have a good reputation, we speed up the process. So, people try things, and they learn from it, so we can learn as well and really increase our capacity to move faster in this field, I would say.
Catherine, you made that sound, and there was a lot of nodding ahead, so let me just flip it back, that harmonization's only good if we actually harmonize to a good standard. Yeah. So if we're harmonizing to crappy regulation, it's a technical legal term, everybody, then we're just in a race to the bottom. So I was at a meeting of medical device regulators a month or two ago, and almost everybody in the room were innovators with the regulators. So the mantra was not about inclusion of patients or clinicians or others, and that was, so harmonization was a very important agenda item, but do you think we need to be careful that we're not harmonizing to, the standard that is the FDA standard or the US standard?
For sure.
I mean, it's fine if it's great, but if it isn't actually what we want globally, if it isn't actually dealing with the salient issues that we're concerned about, from access and equity, maybe that's not the goal. Maybe I'll chuck it over to you, Calvin. I'm throwing the egg amongst the chickens, or the chickens amongst the roosters, or something.
Well, thank you so much. Please let me first start by thanking you, Colleen, for this wonderful opportunity to be involved, and also to Florian, as well as the Center. Really happy to be here and learning a lot from listening to all our colleagues. So I don't have a lot to add to what our colleagues have mentioned, but I think you're spot on. What I do see a special role in terms of legal institution, including the sort of regulatory formation that we see at an international level, is that it has served as a platform for collective action. And by this, I mean collective action not only in terms of having regulators come together, so in terms of norm development and norm formation, but also importantly as a platform for epistemic integration. Perhaps integration is the big word. So at least you have got different knowledge systems coming together and seeing how it could be directed at meeting new challenges where safety and efficacy are concerned. And importantly, what I hope it will continue to do and develop towards is to involve people. So the drawing together of people. And I think this particular development is especially important in order to ensure that developments meet ethical standards, particularly in connection with equitable access. Yeah.
Devin, do you want to weigh in on this one too?
Yeah, definitely. And again, thanks for the invite and a wonderful conference. And thanks to everyone who's here listening so intently. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to take a different approach to it because I think I agree with what's been said already. I don't want to echo the same thing, but I want to give you like a clinical approach to this. So if I put my emergency doctor hat on, we keep hearing in the news, healthcare systems are in crisis. So what does that actually mean? So imagine a big, raging, beautiful fire that was our health system, and that fire is starting to dwindle, right? You've got a few coals left on the fire. You could put some more fuel on there, put some more support on, and the healthcare system will come back to life in a beautiful way. But that's where our healthcare system is at right now. And so it's sad, but it's still there. There's still hope. And so the way I see the urgent need around the adoption of artificial intelligence is to really add capacity to our healthcare systems, right? So that we can do more with a bit less, and so we could really elevate the way we care for patients. So I really see this issue as a matter of life and death for children who come to our hospital, for patients who access our health systems. And so I see regulation as a facilitator to the translation of these technologies to the bedside. Because an industry like healthcare that is extraordinarily risk averse, because it has to be, right? We really have to obsess about patient safety and quality in a way that doesn't exist in other industries. A space like that needs regulation. It needs a clear pathway to say, if I check these boxes, this is what quality means. Let's just throw that out and say, forget it. Let's not regulate. Let's just, wild, wild west and bring things in. And let's let the health system weed out what's going to be legit and not. Well, imagine me talking to you as a patient or about your child as a patient, and I'm going to say, hey, let's use this AI tool. It's going to help automate a bunch of diagnostics. We're going to save a whole bunch of time. You're going to ask me, does it work? Pretty sure. Think so. Yeah, I've looked at it. And my colleagues looked at it in the department, and we think it works pretty well. But that's it. That's the level of scrutiny that the tool went through. A couple of us got together, QI initiative, right? Circumvented the REB with QI, and classic move. And then we deployed this tool, right? You're gonna not really feel so confident about that. And so I think that we risk jeopardizing the actual adoption of AI in Canada if we don't have sound regulatory process in place that inspires confidence in these tools that actually get to the bedside.
So the next question I had was a little bit of a discussion about whether our existing governance of medical devices, our regulation at the federal level here through the Food and Drugs Act, is up to scratch, and how that works in other jurisdictions. So just from the Canadian perspective, some of us have written about some of the problems that we see with the governance of medical devices here now. So one of them is up until very recently, there's been no capacity for Health Canada to license what they call unfixed machine learning tools. So machine learning that is evolving on its own. Health Canada has not been able to, or has no pathway for licensing those kinds of tools. And we're going to talk about the fact that they now have guidance out with new ways to permit that. So they're proposing to permit the licensing of unfixed machine learning tools, and we want to talk about how good or not that is. But that's been an issue up to now. Another issue with the regulations as they currently stand is that there are a lot of sort of exceptions or holes in them. And in particular, unless you actually sell or transfer the technology from one institution to another institution, you're not captured by the rules. So if you're working within a hospital network, you can develop AI inside that network, and it's not captured by the regulation. And we know that a lot of that is happening now in Canada. A lot of it's amazing, but it's also a bit of concern that there are no guardrails around what is happening. Another issue that we see, and this is actually sort of comes up relative to some of the comments earlier, is that there's a lighter regulatory touch if there is, quote unquote, a healthcare provider in the loop. Which some folks have been saying, well, we need human oversight. That's always puzzled me because in healthcare we have a lot of problems with safety and quality because of the humans.
To me?
Not Devin, but everybody else. And very, very difficult for patients to get any redress, or very hard for them to bring any private law claims. Almost impossible, really. So having a provider in the loop who may not understand the technology, who doesn't understand the algorithm, who's somehow meant to oversee, a machine learning tool and protect the patients from its use would seem to be idealistic at best. But having the provider in the loop means that you get a lighter regulatory touch. So, and another problem is that the providers, the innovators themselves, sort of do their own risk assessment. So the regulation, the degree of regulation matches the degree of risk, but the innovators themselves put forward to Health Canada what their risk level is. And that might be fine, but there's no, not a lot of transparency about that process, or if some are coming forward trying to be at a lower risk and they're really at a higher risk. There's no evidence about that from the regulator. So those are some of the concerns that we have raised around our current medical device regulation. And now we're sort of going to level 2.0 with regulation of machine learning medical devices from that platform. So we started over lunch together today, Kelvin, to hear more about how regulation of medical devices is working in China. So we thought we would go with that little potted summary of Canada whistle-top tour to hear about how it's working in China. And then I think we'll go to Jake.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Colleen. Some rather exciting developments. So firstly, just to be clear, in Hong Kong, it's a separate jurisdiction under the one country, two systems governance approach. So within Hong Kong, it remains a very light touch kind of approach, and regulation comes through the provider in the loop, as you've mentioned. The situation, in contrast, is very different on mainland China. So that would be the provider in the loop sort of regulation, but there would also be a rather established regulatory framework for medical devices. Mm-hmm. The framework itself is very similar to what we find in the US. So you'd have essentially a risk-based approach. So you'd have essentially a low-risk medical devices, and an example of a low-risk medical device that fits within that definition is your Band-Aid. One would find it strange to consider Band-Aid a medical device, but in terms of strict legal definition, that's what it is. So because it's low risk, then essentially it's a matter of self-certification by the manufacturer. But if you're talking about something like implantable devices, especially devices with AI or machine learning kind of capabilities, so these will be considered high-risk device, and before they can be marketed in the system, you will need regulatory approval from the National Medical Products Administration. So that's the key regulator in mainland China. So that's the broad framework, but what I'd like to highlight is that there's an important shift in approach to regulation. So because the approach to regulation developed out of how pharmaceutical products are being developed, so it used to be, and it remains the case for essentially low and moderate risk devices, one that is point-in-time review. So as you know, essentially for pharmaceutical products is the gathering of typically phase 1 to phase 3 kind of data, and then you seek regulatory approval from on mainland China, and NMPA, of course, in the US would be the US FDA. And so that's the sort of point-in-time approach. But what we see now, a very important shift in mainland China is an approach towards total device life cycle that you see in the Canadian document as well. And linked to this particular development is a unique device identifier scheme that's been put in place, now tested in a few provinces on the mainland, and if shown to be successful, will be scaled up for implementation across all of China.
So just so that everyone is clear, and most people, many of you in the room might be aware about regulation of prescription medications, there's sort of been a move from an on-off switch. Yes, it's safe, because the deployment in real-life populations, you know, they're not the sort of golden people you put in clinical trials, but people with multiple illnesses, elderly, taking multiple drugs. When you actually start using it in the real world, then you start to see problems. So this has led to more of what they call a life cycle approach, and they have been trying to bring the same approach to medical devices. And of course, when we think about machine learning, it's absolutely essential, right, that you have this kind of whole life cycle approach, this whole kind of what we call post-market on-off. But you can already start to see just how complicated it is to start to regulate this, because, you know, as regulators plodding along with the dinosaurs, we had sort of on, off, stop, start, and now suddenly we've got to switch to this sort of, you know, surveillance sort of place where we're looking at these products through their whole life cycle. So, Jake, is this the case too in the countries that you're working with in Africa?
So for Nigeria, I just worked with the current government to develop a national AI policy, which they've done for the last 2 years. And, you know, when you look at Nigeria, for example, we don't have like a pre-market like evaluation or a post-market surveillance. And I'll tell you why. What we do have in Nigeria, for example, which is in tandem with over 18 countries on the continent, is that we have the NAFDAC, the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, and they are the ones with the power to sort of regulate medical devices. What we do have in Nigeria, for example, is we have local medical device regulations we developed in 2018, and then we have foreign medical device regulations we developed in 2021. In the last 4 years, if you look at the ratio of where we fall under, the ratio is 1:9, being that we import more than we create, which is obvious. So Nigeria is not necessarily looking at its biggest look, it's looking towards Canada, number one, US, and China. It's hoping that if you regulate adequately, we would not have to deal with some of the problems. So things around like sensitivity checks, algorithmic bias checks, and the rest, we are hoping that these are covered. The reason is because we find that there's a loophole across sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the medical devices, interestingly, are donated. And so they cure that loophole of having to go through the scrutiny of, of regulation, which is why, I mean, there's a common saying we have in my culture. We say, if you're going to cross a river in a crowd so that the crocodile doesn't bite you, right? That's why the biggest focus for Nigeria and a couple of African countries is the African Medical Device Forum, which you tweeted and added me on X. So we're thinking of how do we harmonize in a way that we can, because that's the only way we can influence countries like Canada to say, please look at all of these things, right, because these devices are developed in your jurisdiction.
Okay, that's great. So I want to turn to the regulatory challenges. So, you know, some of what we should be doing, and I think I've already indicated that this is not easy. You know, I think it is, to me, it seems like one of the greatest regulatory challenges I could imagine. And that, you know, just as we have this rapid pace of innovation, how can we innovate, how we regulate to match it? So I want to turn to that, and I thought I'd start with you, Devin, to maybe tell us how you see what the regulatory challenges are, because I think as an innovator and someone who thinks about the whole healthcare system as well, you probably have the rarest of insights here.
And a lot to say, but I'm trying to pare it down right now, because I could probably talk for hours on this.
There's a bar afterwards.
Yes. With
Yeah,
drinks?
Yeah. Well, hopefully a bar will have, but you never know.
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is around like the whole static versus fixed AI and unfixed or adaptive AI, whatever the terminology is. I actually think we might be not thinking about the technology in the right way from the beginning, because we're making this assumption that a static model, right, is safe. That like you in this point of time, you've evaluated the model, and then you say, oh, here's how good the model works. Just like here's how good this new MRI machine works. Perfect, great, they both work great. And then over time, they're gonna perform the same. And the MRI machine probably will. There's a life cycle to the magnet and whatever, and that's just no knowledge on when the magnet needs to be changed in an MRI machine. But the model, it's not clear most of the time, when will the performance of that fixed model deteriorate? So I can give you a really practical example. At SickKids, we have these really cool models that they can predict what test kids would need, and we're one day soon going to propose the model just order the test on the child without a human in the loop, which is really interesting, and we can talk about that at the bar. But the idea of us then testing that model and understanding how it behaves, well, it was working brilliantly before the pandemic, right? Really high precision of the model, fixed. The moment the pandemic came, we started to worry about a whole bunch of different issues related to heart problems in kids, and the model performance just tanked. So now if the regulatory post-market surveillance of that model wasn't in place, and it's not in place, so if it wasn't in place, right, would the innovator have thought to check the performance if it's gonna cost X amount of dollars in surveillance, monitoring, and if they checked, are they going to report it when they've, maybe they're making tens of millions of dollars off this model, right? So that's a problem. This idea that because it's fixed, we're going to treat it like another piece of hardware is totally wrong. And I actually think it is not safe. And I think the reason why we haven't seen issues related to this is that AI just hasn't yet translated to the bedside, right? So it's coming. This whole dilemma, mark my words today, like it's coming, and we're gonna see issues come up from this. So I actually think fixed versus unfixed, it's the same sort of issue, and it's really more about how do you maintain confidence in model performance. Because the solution to this fixed model dilemma is you need to retrain the model. And so we showed that by just simply allowing the model to retrain on updated data and sort of relearn, just like how we are on this data as humans, the model performance stayed the same. But then suddenly that's an unfixed model. The more risky model. It's actually the safer model, in my opinion.
Right.
And so, just to wrap up really quickly, then this idea is now we're going to have, and it's some sort of anticipated change plan.
Yeah.
Right.
The PCP.
PCCP or something like
Yeah.
that. There's a couple C's there.
PCC.
And so I actually think that makes sense, right? But I don't think it necessarily should be applied to only unfixed models, because to me, no model should actually just be static, right? Based on the example I'm explaining to you. And so it makes sense that then you're going to require the innovator to say, yes, here's the model, here's the performance envelope of what is accepted, right? This is what's safe. How are you going to continue to monitor that piece of technology, which in computer science is called machine learning operations? And then if you cross a certain line, does that trigger like reporting to Health Canada? When does it trigger taking your model off the market? Or when does it trigger retraining? I think having a plan in place like that just makes sense. That's what we're doing at SickKids and at Hero AI, not because it's mandated, because it's just like common sense from a technology perspective. But that needs to be reflected in the regulatory landscape, because it's expensive.
It's quite interesting, because a few years ago, it was the sort of mantra was, we don't need pre-market approval so much, we should focus on post-market surveillance. And now, but with the machine learning guidelines, it's actually very soft or quiet on the post-market surveillance, except to the extent that it falls into the, what innovator might bring forward and propose for the marketing itself. But, to your point, we really should be talking about things like random audits. We should be, for everyone, regardless of whether you have a plan in place, whether the risk that you've identified as you come to market, because the risk that actually manifests itself might be very different down the line. right? We don't really know how it will evolve or devolve. We can have a pretty good guess from the get-go, but it might change down the line. So
the real quick piece on this is that just from an innovator, put that hat on. I imagine a world where there's an API, which just means a secure way for me to transfer data, and I have a system that's constantly monitoring the performance, and at whatever given frequency makes sense, I just send that data to Health Canada. Right? Like, to me, that would be brilliant. It'd be super easy for me to do that. I could create that system for Health Canada. That takes like 4 weeks to do with the stuff that we have already built at SickKids. So we could build something like that then makes it really, it's like using technology to elevate our capabilities of post-market surveillance for AI. Why not do that?
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But the thing is, are the resources that we see at these big tertiary hospitals like SickKids and the other hospitals where we actually have machine learning experts inside the hospitals, fine-tuning machine learning, are they going to be at, I was mentioning the private long-term care homes or, the smaller hospitals, the more far-flung places. So the regulation needs to account for not the best, the ideal world that we might have, but also the more riskier, potentially, places of use. Catherine, do you want to weigh in on this one too?
Yes, so I think, and I'm a big fan of ex-ante measure in the AI field, so to make sure that we avoid as much as possible any problems for occurring in the first place. So all these risk assessment mechanisms that we can develop to guide the developers, or did you think about that? Or what are you going to do to make sure that you avoid it? So all these tools, I think they are really important. That being said, as you just mentioned, post-market surveillance is a big one. And we really haven't very figured out how it should work to really help the developers, but also the people who are, at the end of the day, using these technologies, patients, physicians, and all healthcare workers. So that capacity to really develop something that makes sense, time to go. Bar is open. So yeah, that's something I'm struggling with. Like, how can you develop appropriate mechanisms for patients, make it very easy to really signal things, right? Even healthcare providers. So if I'm a nurse and I realize that this triage AI tool, like really how do you say that? Make sure that at the end of the day, it's men that benefit from the triage tool more than women or any other groups. That's something that she or he needs to be able to mention, to have access to someone and really make sure they have like this feedback loop. That's something that's really important, and we haven't nailed this one, I would say. The other thing, and I just wrote a paper on this, it's going to be published in a few months. There's a thing about a legal scholar that we think that once it's in the rules, it's all solved, right? Yeah. But I think it's way more complex than that. And I think to have really human-centered approaches in AI, we need to be able to connect the norms with the context. So the real journey of an innovation in the specific context of a hospital or any other healthcare institution, how it works, how people can really use this tool, if they have any problem with it, how they make sure this technology evolve, any reflective approach that they can have with this technology, and really support it in the context. And our capacity to connect the norms, like the playing field that you have when you use a technology and when you use it in practice, and how you can make sure that this tool makes sense in your practice. You can adapt it, you can negotiate with your colleagues how it's going to be embedded, what works, what doesn't work. I think there's something there in capacity to connect the two. So read the paper. But yeah, that's so there are many more things that we could say about that. And the innovation, again, like we hear this so often, I'm sure you heard it, like rules stop innovation. I mean, wait for a big scandals and that will stop your innovation. That's what I'm gonna say. But we know it's not true for so many reasons. And there's a lot I work a lot with innovators in Quebec, and what they say, we consulted them on many AI tools, and they say, well, I'm not sure, I don't want to use this tool. Perhaps it makes sense, but I don't know about my liability if I use it. What's my responsibility? What's the other's responsibility? So that unclearness about the impact and their legal responsibility is a big block So we shouldn't see this challenge in a much bigger way, and we need to bring more than innovators and regulators in a room, as you mentioned, for sure.
Yeah, I think the issue around the surveillance and making sure that clinicians and patients, are able to signal, and I think, Calvin, you were saying that is provided for in the Chinese approach to regulation of medical devices, right? So
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the hope under the unique device identifier scheme. Because it'd be interesting, well, I think not just interesting, it'd be important to see how it develops, because it does require a stronger participatory approach from both providers as well as patients in order to ensure that the system works. But as you've mentioned, Colleen, I think that's the only way forward if we are to think about enabling health systems to draw on the benefits of increasingly autonomous, widely defined medical devices.
So a number of folks in the room today have mentioned the risk of algorithmic bias, and when it comes to health AI tools, this is obviously a very significant risk. It seems like most of the health AI tools are trained on a few data sets from a couple of hospitals in the US, and then deployed in all sorts of different ways, so that's a worrisome thing. We have written, many of us, about how the regulator should speak to the issue of algorithmic bias as part of their regulation of safety, because if the product is not trained on a particular equity-seeking group, but the AI tool is used on that group, it may not work. It might undertreat, it might overtreat, it might misdiagnose. So there are some real worries. So it's not just the discrimination aspect of algorithmic bias that we're concerned about, but the actual real safety effect of algorithmic bias. So the good news is in the guidance for the machine learning tools that Health Canada has put out, they acknowledge the importance of algorithmic bias, but maybe leave a little bit to be desired. So maybe I'll go to you again, Catherine, for some thoughts on that, and then we can hear from Jake and Calvin, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions, so we've got some time.
Okay, perfect. So, so that's really out of the oven. So it's really new. We're still wondering what this guidance is going to do concretely, but just to give the specific name, because it's kind of weird, pre-market guidance for machine learning enabled medical device. So that's the new guidance that Health Canada has recently put on its website. So it really is for the purpose of what the manufacturer needs to consider when they are applying for a machine learning and medical device. So that's the main policy goal of this guidance. And I would start with the positive, right? That's always good to start with the positive, and then perhaps flag a few problematic aspects, and what would be a legal scholar without positive criticism at some point. So I will talk about that. So first, it really mentions, I think that's the positive thing, they really emphasize the importance of transparency in ensuring the safety and effectiveness of a medical device. And they say it, and then it's a bit less clear how to make sure that you really are transparent on many levels, but still it's at the heart of this guidance. And for instance, in the labeling phase, they really ask to divulgate a lot of information about that would be useful for end users to use it in a appropriate way. So that's something I've really been asking for many years, to make sure that when you use this tool in a hospital or as a patient, because they can be direct for a patient, that you have sufficient information to know if it's appropriate to use it in the specific context. So that's again, I would say. Also, this guidance mentioned recognize the role of life cycle, or the importance of life cycle in AI. So that's something that you flag, but that's still a plus. There are 8 phases mentioned in the guidance, so it's pretty detailed, I would say. Usually we don't have that many phases, but that's not a big problem. It also introduces that PCCP thing. So the name is Predetermined Change Control Plan. So that's something that is useful to when you have a known risk with a machine learning medical device tool, you have to complete this form, I would say, to make sure that you don't have to, first that you recognize it and that you have a plan to control it, you have some risk assessment, and you really detail what it means. And the purpose is not to go constantly again to Health Canada if that's the case. And an example of a change could be, the performance of a machine learning medical device tools can reduce or really change over time. So that's an example of something that you need to consider. So that's the general thing, but then about the bias. So it's mentioned in many places in the guidance. So it really mentioned the need to limit bias in the data use. So that's great, I would say, but also in practice when you use the AI tools. And it mentions it in many different ways. For instance, at a broad level, that it should adequately represent the Canadian population and the clinical practice. That's for the data. Also, that it should be safe and effective for the intended population. So that's, again, something that is important for biases. So it includes, you need to include consideration, for instance, of skin pigmentation, biological differences between sexes, and so on. And also we have to explain how the biases will be controlled. And so it comes back in different places. I think it's a good thing. Then the more puzzling thing that is added in the guidance is that you should use, and again, a strange expression, the sex and gender-based analysis, the GBA. Okay, and that's something, and they say that you should use it across the life cycle of the technology. So again, that's positive. We recognize the life cycle. And that tool wasn't really specific for machine learning device. It was more broadly something that Health Canada could use. So it's tough to really understand how you would use it as a developer. Oh, okay, I see. But still, it's mentioned, and it really requires you to assess how your innovation can have an impact on diverse groups and people. So about the problematic part, and I'm almost done. So a lot of wording in this guidance is about you should consider. Okay, so for a lawyer right there is something that raise a red flag. Mm-hmm. So, and it comes back to what Kate Crawford mentioned yesterday, something that bugs me a lot these days is it's a lot about self-enforcement still. And perhaps it's because a lot of these things are negotiated between only innovators, and which for sure they are really important by the regulators, but you need to enlarge the conversation to include other considerations. So again, it's really like we ask you to consider these things, but how we are going to make sure that we have the adequate evidence, and also that the companies do their due diligence when they make sure that they don't have any biases.
I was just going to say, from Jake was saying, there's a lot riding on. It's not just Canadian populations, but other jurisdictions around the world might be relying on us getting this correct from an algorithmic bias perspective, not just at one point in time, but over the entire life cycle as it's deployed in different places and spaces with different populations of very different characteristics. So it's a bit worrisome that it's sort of maybe that would be nice to do kind of a request. Yep. So Jake, would you like to comment on this at all?
Yeah, I would just quickly say, when we think of algorithmic bias as a technical problem, we are begetting using an engineering framework as a solution, right? And I think the point you make is really clear. When you look at the sexual and gender-based analysis plus, I think it needs to be more robust in the way that it considers race and indigeneity, for example. But the same thing like what Craig Crawford talked about, the politics of classification when it comes to bias. That's where the thing comes from. These cartographies and taxonomies of who's been represented and who's not. Yes, there are technical solutions for that, and I think the pre-market guardians could use some of what I call the 3 C's, control, the use of counterfactuals, the fact that not only Canadians are going to use this, the use of counteractive tools like clinician support systems to be able to explain that. In our work with the Canadian African AI Data Innovation Consortium, you find that having people to be able to bridge understanding how these tools work, when these tools should be used or not used, is very critical. But when it comes to algorithmic bias, I think the conversation starts from multidisciplinary support teams, not necessarily about a technical analysis of representing the Canadian population, because that alone itself is a problem.
Oh yeah, no, I think. Okay, so this is great, and I think I've learned even more than I knew before, so that's always a good thing. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so if anybody would like to ask a question of the panel, I think there are microphones there, and we'd love to hear from you. Oh, yeah, we've got a willing victim.
Willing victim.
Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'll make sure my question's smaller for this one. We talked a lot about the life cycle of the AI system within healthcare, but what about the life cycle of the human in relation to AI? And I think my question primarily surrounds the concept of education, which I think is relevant in more than one domain in concern of AI, but one of the regulatory tools that we use in healthcare is education as a means of certifying this individual to be capable to perform the function that they need to.
Yeah.
For instance, X-ray technicians need to be certified X-ray technicians. But say you're a doctor in the ER and you're using a AI-assisted medical device, and you know that this medical device has a 99% success rate of providing the right result. How do you ensure as a medical professional that you're using your best judgment as a human, that even though the AI system has that statistic probability of being correct, that I'm still as a human ensuring not falling into that kind of trap to say that it's correct, it knows what it's talking about, and I don't need to really think about it. And so how does this go into the education perspective of how do we approach that in terms of certifying individuals to be able to use these technologies in the healthcare setting, whether in North America, whether in Nigeria or Hong Kong, and all individuals within healthcare that might be interacting with these technologies?
Devin, do you want to
Sure,
take that one?
that's a great question. And so just around the education of those who are using the AI in the healthcare space across these different facets. And so the first thing that came to mind when you were asking that question was around the ability of a physician to obtain informed consent from a patient for the use of an AI tool, right? And so the physician clearly needs to understand some level of the technology to adequately explain that to the patient, even just to maintain this concept that is core in healthcare around informed consent. And it's informed consent that then enables patient autonomy, right? And so even from the foundational level of what is ethical medical practice, education in AI is going to be key. When you talk about this idea of education, we'll know that there's really great progress. So U of T, really proud to say that the lectures that I do at U of T are now mandatory for U of T medical students to take. They get tested on it, they hate it at times, but we have exam questions on it. So we're starting to make more formal education training as a mandatory component to training. But the piece around the X-ray, right? And the X-ray says 99%, but I don't think that's the right answer. There is some historical precedence of stuff like this. So ECGs used to come, and they still do, come with an output that says what the diagnosis is, or a reading on the top. It used to be pretty crappy. It's gotten much better because of AI. But we would look at that, and then as the physician, I couldn't hang my hat on that. I had to actually look at the patient holistically. There's blood work tests, there's clinical exams, there's, the history, and all of those things have to come into play to then making my clinical decision, and that tool was just one of those facets. The thing that worries me a little bit, though, with then this physician on the loop concept is what happens when there's 200 AI tools informing aspects of care on this patient? The physician starts to lose control. You can't expect me to understand all of these things, right? And so education is only going to take us so far, and I think it leans back onto why the regulatory process needs to be really sound.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, well, I think it's also just important to realize that it's something like 97% of avoidable error to patients is never litigated. So this sort of idea that, you know, physicians, apart from Devon, are infallible and saint-like is just incorrect. And so the other problem you have to worry about is physicians and clinicians not using the AI when the AI is actually superior, but they're referring back to their course with Devon back in 2023 when he said, you know, XXX about the technology, and now the technology in, you know, 20 years plus, and they haven't really attended to many of their, you know, keeping up their competency sessions, has radically changed, right? So there's also that risk, the other risk of automation bias is a risk, but also thinking that you're superior to something that is actually superior to you is also problematic. So I don't know how you solve that one, but it is a very significant issue.
Can I plant one quick seed?
No. Okay. No, don't.
When we think about like the error that happens, whether it's like, you know, harm from a new medication that comes to market, the error or harm rate is 0.05, let's say. That's 0.05 on a population of people that is only maybe a couple 100,000 who needed that medication, maybe a couple million. These AI tools are going to be used on everyone.
Yeah.
So that 0.05, the impact is going to ripple, both incredibly positive, but also some harm. So Health Canada, the last little advocacy pieces, I really think we need to advocate that Health Canada receives the funding and the support, because clearly the things you're talking about are all the right things to hit on, right, on what they're trying to achieve and do, but they really need to, I think we need to advocate for them to receive the resources so that they can really elevate the regulatory reform.
Yeah,
I really agree with
have
that.
a tough agenda. Matthias, do you have a question? Yeah. And
Okay, thank you so much for this fabulous panel. We learned a lot. I want to, when we discuss other health technologies like drugs, vaccines, and even more traditional medical devices, very often we're invited to discuss things like affordability, pricing, which drags from regulatory frameworks like intellectual property, drug pricing controlling, public procurement, things like that. I was wondering if for AI medical device, this seems to you as an important issue as well, and if it is, how it's similar or different from the old technologies like drugs, vaccines, or other medical devices, for instance. Thank you.
so, sorry, Matthias, that was like a rush.
Sorry.
So your question is about access and funding and decision-making about inclusion and public insurance systems, is that it?
Yeah, I was more thinking if issues like access and affordability to health technologies, like intellectual properties rights, for instance, issues that oppose access groups and innovators on vaccines, for instance, if these are issues as well in these technologies that we are discussing here in this panel.
Yeah. Calvin or Jake, would you like to take that one?
Maybe before Professor Calvin, that's exactly the big equity issue for a lot of low and middle income countries, because pricing, affordability, access to these tools are what our biggest concern is. And we would like the high income countries to also think about the regulation in this area, because it's more of an international global health concern. But you are like an expert here. Maybe you can, you guys have gone way, way farther than.
Oh, not quite. Yeah, well, certainly not me. But but to share on what I know, and thank you so much. A great question there. It's fascinating to consider that when Alan Turing first developed the first computer in the 1930s, it was already anticipated that some of these computers could adapt to its environment. But because of the pressure of war, Alan Turing just focused on what he called the A machine rather than the C machine. So the A machine will be the static devices, and we have, of course, the usual challenges, and as you've mentioned, all the rules that are in place, right, for safe pharmaceutical products. They will continue to apply, not foolproof, of course, but generally they will apply to static medical devices. But the problem with algorithms with machine learning and deep learning capabilities is that they could adapt to the environment. And why it's so difficult to address these from a regulatory standpoint is because they can optimize the performance, but we don't quite know what this performance could be. So when we think about the situation in China, the approach is therefore not just to have regulation fixated on the device itself, but to look more broadly at the data environment. Because ultimately how well these devices work will depend on the quality of your data environment. If you've got a poor data environment, you're going to be faced with a lot more challenges than the benefits that can come out of it. Which is why from a global health standpoint, the issue of equity is so difficult. You can transpose, arguably, static devices from one perhaps high-income setting to a low-income setting, but you cannot transpose an entire data environment, a health system quality, from one to another. So I'm afraid no clear response at this stage, but I just wanted to end off by saying that as far as WHO is concerned, its ethical guidance document is very clear. If you're a policymaker working in this space, you should consider within your health system whether it is the right time to bring in the technology. Because if it is not, if you don't have regulatory mechanisms in place, you don't have the right environment, you should not engage yet, but have other developments in place.
That's so interesting. Okay, I've got the, please wrap up that end, stop. So I will do that. I just want to thank you for your engagement and to thank our wonderful panelists for this great discussion. And we will hear from Florian. I guess we are on a break, right? Yeah.
And thanks,
Thank you.
Colleen. Thank you.